After I listened to last week's message, I spent nearly 3 days unsuccessfully fighting this one particular earworm before I gave up. Y'all know what earworms are. They're those songs you just can't get out of your head, no matter how hard you try. This song didn't pop into my head immediately, although one of this morning's hymns did. In fact, it was the one we just sang. And I just couldn't get rid of it. I don't know why this one song affected me as strongly as it apparently did, although I'm quite clearly not the only one to remember it. I Googled the title in order to double check that I had remembered all the lyrics correctly, and I found no less than 3 different recorded versions of it, 2 of them on YouTube. I mean, it's not as if it's one of the great or most profound hymns of the church like Amazing Grace or A Mighty Fortress is Our God or O Sacred Head Now Wounded or Be Thou My Vision. It's not even of the same quality as the really popular songs in the hymnals, like How Great Thou Art or Morning is Broken. We never sang it in the fellowship group I attended in college either. It's really one of those things that you learn in summer camp, which I never had the money to go to, not even at Quaker Lake, or in youth group during high school, or maybe even a few years before that. Here's the first half of it. A disciple named Peter once walked on the water from a ship on a dark, stormy night. He walked toward the Master on top of the water, but he started to sink and he cried out in fright. "Oh, Lord, save me," he cried out in fright, for he started to sink on that dark, stormy night. Then the hand of the Master saved him from the water, who had feared both the wind and the waves. And the Lord said to Peter on top of the water, "Oh, why did you doubt? You have so little faith. You will sink if you give in to doubt, but you'll stay up on top when your faith wins out." As I said, it's not great and profound and grand, but I just couldn't get it out of my head. And finally I gave up. If you compare those lyrics with our text for this morning, which is Matthew 14:22-33, you'll see that the lyrics basically summarize the story found there. Then he, that is Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was many furlongs distant from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. So in other words, a storm had come up and either they had sailed right into the middle of it, or more likely it had swooped down on them when they weren't expecting it. And in the 4th watch of the night, which is between 3 and 6 in the morning, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately he spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, have no fear." And Peter, bless him, Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "O man of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The incident just prior to our story this morning is the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only one of Jesus' miracles to be recounted in all four Gospels in the New Testament. Like I've said before, Christians have this food fixation from way back. Then we have our story. Now, I have something of a history with this particular passage. Way back when, in 1987, just after I played Mordecai the Innkeeper in Fiddler on the Roof, I gave the message at Kernersville Friends meeting, and some of my new friends from that cast showed up to hear what I had to say. I used this passage as my text, but try as I might, I cannot recall exactly what point it was I was trying to make. What I do remember is that I was retelling the story, and I got to the part where Jesus tells Peter to climb out of the boat and come to him by walking across the top of the water. And the way I put it back then was that Peter suddenly realized what it was that he was doing, looked down at his feet and said, "Oi!" And that's when he started to sink. It's a bit like the Tom and Jerry or Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons, isn't it? Tom the cat is chasing Jerry the mouse and runs off the end of a table or kitchen counter, hanging in midair for just a minute with his feet working furiously all the while. Or the coyote runs off the edge of a cliff while chasing the Roadrunner and does the same thing. Then the cat or the coyote looks down, and at that point he falls. Seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same, and sometimes that's even true where humor is concerned. Anyway, since the story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water is in Matthew, that means that a version of it is probably also in one of the so-called synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called synoptic, which comes from a Greek word meaning viewed together. And when you look at the three Gospels side by side, it becomes clear that the basic framework for all three comes from Mark, which is the earliest of them. I've said before that Matthew and Luke were what you might call script doctors nowadays. They add details and entire stories not in Mark, and they omit details and entire stories in Mark which don't fit into their pictures of Jesus. The upshot is that stories in Mark's gospel have parallels in one or both of the others, and the reverse is often true. This morning's passage in Matthew doesn't appear in Luke in any form, but there is a parallel passage in Mark 6:45 to 52, where we read about Jesus walking on the water as he does here. But there's nothing at all about Peter doing the same thing, however briefly. What gives? Now, some people who read either Matthew's version of the story, where both Jesus and Peter walk on the water, or Mark's version, where only Jesus does, get hung up on the miraculous elements of the story. Either they're traditionalists who defend a literal understanding of the text, or they try to offer a more rational explanation for the events recounted, or they have problems with the miraculous and dismiss the narrative altogether. I, on the other hand, think that all three of these approaches miss the point. What we have here is probably what Christians would call a parable and what Jews would call a midrash. You might have encountered the definition of a parable as an illustrative story containing a comparison of some sort which serves to illuminate or illustrate some spiritual point. In Jewish tradition, on the other hand, the word midrash refers to a rabbinical exercise which seeks to interpret the biblical text either as regards the law of Moses or by expanding upon some non-legal portion of the Bible using parables, legends, folk tales, and so on. The latter sort of midrash is called a Haggadic midrash. Haggadah is the word for telling, and that is also what they call the booklets that you have at the Passover Seder every year, and you go through it before you're allowed to eat. There's that eating again. For most of us, the most familiar example of this genre, Haggadic Midrash, will be the book of Jonah, which has often received interpretive treatment similar to the story of Jesus or of Jesus and Peter walking on the water. At some point after Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jewish exiles to move back to the land of Judah and the city of Jerusalem, the writer of Jonah took the brief mention of an obscure prophet in 2 Kings 14:25 and expanded upon it by crafting the unforgettable tale of a reluctant prophet who has to be dragged kicking and screaming into fulfilling his mission, which succeeds, despite the prophet's own very fervent hope that it won't. The writer of Jonah has created a literary and spiritual masterpiece, focusing on the literal details of the story, such as what sort of aquatic animal swallows Jonah and how he could survive in there, misses the point. The whole point of the book of Jonah, where the only Jew in the story is the one character who comes off looking the worst, is that the nations of the world would love to have the relationship with God which the Jews have, and will move toward God when given the slightest opportunity, which is evidently God's preference as well. Unfortunately, some Jews, probably the ones like Ezra and Nehemiah, who forcibly broke up mixed marriages and expelled all the non-Jewish wives and children, won't share with the rest of the world the blessings that they've been given. Similarly, when we come back to the story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water, if you focus on the miraculous elements in the narrative, you miss the essential point of the story. As it happens, the second half of the song, which I could not for any amount of money or by dint of any effort on my part get out of my head this past week, makes the point fairly well. To walk on the water, to walk and not falter, there is one certain thing you must do. Keep your eyes on the master and not on the water. Don't look at the storm or you'll start to fall through. Walk in faith and you will not go down. But if you should falter, he won't let you drown. Now, like the disciple we find in the Bible, you can do the impossible thing. But if you should doubt, you'll never find out all the wonderful miracles faith can bring. You can do the impossible thing and see all the miracles faith can bring. Just a quick word here on doubt. There are at least two kinds of doubt. One type of doubt motivates you to make sure you're being honest with yourself and with God, however, and whatever you understand God to be, assuming, of course, that you believe in a higher power, as they say in the 12-step programs. And another sort of doubt paralyzes you, robs you of hope, and makes you unable to conceive of the possibility that things can ever get any better. It's that second sort of doubt we're meant to avoid. Now, it's fairly easy to understand what must have happened. Mark tells a story about Jesus walking across the water toward his disciples, who are in a boat during the middle of a storm and are very much afraid that the storm will sink their boat and drown them all. The disciples are also fearful when they see Jesus walking on the surface of the water. I mean, how many times do you see somebody you know walking across the waves? I mean, it's around 3 or 4 in the morning, and the disciples think they're seeing a ghost. But he speaks reassuringly to them, walks over to their boat, and gets in. And that's when the storm dies and is replaced by the calm. The symbolic meaning of the story in Mark is pretty clear. Jesus is in the boat with you during the storms of life and brings those storms to an end. Now, when Matthew comes along, 10 or 15 years or so after Mark, he goes Mark 1 better. Not only does Jesus walk on the water and calm the storm in Matthew, but Peter, who is often an everyman figure, sort of stand-in for all of us, walks on the water until he reaches Jesus. And that's when Peter sees the strength of the wind. He freaks out and he starts sinking. And that's also when Jesus catches Peter, lifts him up, and walks him back to the boat. Perhaps Matthew wanted to make sure that we all got the point that miracles can happen to us too, and not just Jesus. The whole story in Matthew reminds me a bit of the part of last week's message, which described about taking swimming lessons as a kid, and how you have to relax in order to learn how to float, which is something I never did. I didn't learn how to swim until I was actually it was between Guilford and going to England. Do you remember the description of being still and letting go, trusting that you'll be buoyant enough to float? You remember the part about being able to discern the presence of the swimming instructor's hand just below you because of the movement of the water beneath your back? Part of Matthew's point is that if you have faith, you can handle whatever storms life throws at you the same way that you can float if you trust that the water will buoy you up. Now, the next 6 months or so promise to be a trying time for all of us in this country. Many people are already limiting their exposure to the news because of how nasty the various election campaigns are becoming, and it's only the beginning of August. And the expected political storms are in addition to the usual storms of life. Worries about health, safety, finances, our loved ones, our jobs, and so forth. In the light of all this, and in full awareness of the stories about Jesus and Peter's aquatic stroll, I'll leave you with these words of wisdom from the prophet Isaiah. In returning and rest shall you be saved. In quietness and confidence shall be your strength. Amen.